Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is. My name's James Hankins, at Vizer Consulting, and on behalf of kind of isolated talks, yeah, we're still in lockdown, um, and for a very good cause, Samaritans. I'm going to have or take a few moments of your time to talk about share of search, or the the most well-known metric of that everyone has heard of in 2020, it seems. Previously entitled The Metrics No One's Ever Heard of. Um, so I've made a few notes to try and keep me on course because otherwise I yabber on quite a lot. And I'm quite invested in Share of Search, quite excited about it. I believe it opens up a huge number of options for critically questioning and understanding business performance. Um, so I suppose where to start? Well, it starts back in 2012 when I did some work with the wonderful Paul Dyson on Coca-Cola. We were using digital metrics as signals for, of all things, brand love. Brand love. But I began playing with stuff over the next few years, and kind of about 6 years ago, during some of my playing, I lighted on this relationship, which was share of search is a very, very good proxy for market share. Now, why is that important? Well, profit's great. And people look at profit and go, "Yep, they've gone up every year," or not, as the case may be. Revenue's great. Again, it's very, very interesting. But both of those measures are typically validated against the company itself. So it'll be year on years, or it'll be percentage change versus last year. That's great, but kind of ultimately, business is about winning as well. Winning versus the competitors. And the one of the best measures of looking at that or comparing that is market share. Market share is expensive and difficult to get hold of because you're relying on third parties, big research companies, to do kind of EPOS dips or surveys and compare all your competitors. Obviously, they'll bucket it up as well in the way that they see fit, so they'll kind of create the competitor set as they want it rather than as you may want it. Um, and only the biggest businesses can actually afford it because it is expensive. Now, that's where share of search comes in because it's based off Google Trends, and that's a free tool, free kind of platform across multiple different countries. And therefore, what this discovery allows you to do for every business and every brand in the world is to have a comparative measure that's directly related to monetary value as well. It's not a vanity metric. There is money at the end of the rainbow. There clearly is. Now, on its own, I suppose that's it. That is what share of search is. Share of search equals or is a very accurate proxy of share of market. Now, I've typically calculated it on a 12-month basis, 12-month average, and I've seen it work across multiple different categories. I think I've got upwards of 20 categories so far. And there are people all over the world now using it and having a look at it, looking to enhance our understanding of it because it's a bit of a black box from Google. But they don't seem to be faffing around with it at the moment too much. But yes, so that's what it is. It's based on the insight that people typically search in proportion to how they spend or what they spend on. And So someone like Byron Sharp acknowledges that is typically the case, and most brand measures follow market share anyway. So is this just another one? Behavior follows market share, or market share follows behavior. Um, there are questions around its leading and lagging capability, but I've seen it, or I've used it and analyzed it live, so with no time shift. But I know other people are looking into that. I know Les Burnett has looked into it from a motor perspective, and the challenges out there with other businesses to prove it. So you have this wonderful metric that gives you very, very useful proxy around how you're competing versus your competitors, how you're performing. Are you winning? Are you losing? Are you moving in line with what you'd expect the category to grow? Um, and I suppose again, that's the simplicity of it. But I'm not a quant. I am not a statistician. I'm not a mathematician. I know techniques. I know tools. I can use Excel pretty comfortably. I'd like to learn Python. Do I really need to learn it? I don't know. But I understand how to do stuff. But again, I'm a strategist. I'm not a data person. So where I've differed from Les, and where I've differed from other practitioners, is applying it and using it to enhance my understanding of a business or a category, and around the dynamics of that business and category, um, with relation to inputs. So yes, you roll it, you look at the average, and you have a time series that reaches back to 2004, and you can split it by kind of week, month, day, depending on the data download that you get. I typically work on 12 months, but you can look at kind of weekly data, and you can roll that 3 monthly. I know Les has looked at that, or 12 monthly, like I do. And then you have a lovely line versus your competitor set. Now, you can take my word for it, which, yeah, you can trust me. But the most exciting thing about this is the next step, which is validating. So I would always recommend validating for your category, for your business, for your competitor set. Um, that does mean a bit of detective work. So I typically try and find revenue data. So that might mean public companies. They've got published accounts that you can get hold of very, very easily. Kind of investor relations websites are where they are held. In the UK, we have kind of Companies House that hold private industry or private companies accounts, published accounts. So you can get that hold of free, that free. In other countries, might not be accessible. You might have to pay a fee. Quite often there's publicly available information as well. I've been looking at a number of different categories in the States, and whilst accounts are less easy to come across there, quite often somebody has done the work for you, in finding revenue, and that's what you're looking for, is revenue data. So once you've got revenue data for your collection of competitors, it's then about comparing share of revenue, share of value market share, against your share of search for the same period. Like, kind of, if the accounts all come in April, then you look at the corresponding kind of share of search measure from April of that year. Very, very simple cross plot, and you have a look. I think you'd be surprised how accurate it is consistently. What we're finding is that different categories have different levels of accuracy. So FMCG seems to kind of have an R squared of around about 0.6. So, or zero point 0.6 to 0.7. So the variation in the data is could be easily described by up to 60-70% by the metric that you're looking at. Like, they are the same thing, they move at the same rate. There's obviously going to be variation, and that's where the interest comes along. And looking at that, you may see distinct or large bits of variation, you may see less. and that becomes a leaping off point for additional kind of analysis. What does the gap between share of search and share of market actually mean at a brand level, for example? In motor, um, we believe it represents desirability. Kind of the bigger brands, the more desirable brands like Audi and BMW, have greater share of search than they do market share, value market share, because people desire those cars and they have an interest outside of buying them. Um, I mean, that doesn't port through to kind of supermarkets in the UK. But when you look at supermarkets in the UK, Asda overperform versus or share of search versus share of market, and Sainsbury's underperform. So their share of market is greater than their share of search. Now, they are about the same in terms of market share levels, so the difference is in share of search. So I believe, or I've hypothesized, that the difference is it's based on essential number of customers. So Asda have lower prices than Sainsbury's, and but they have more customers. So customers with a lower basket value versus a higher basket value of Sainsbury's, primarily driven by price. Now, what that means is that you've got more people searching. Now, I think that could be why Asda outperform. It's a hypothesis, and that's kind of why this share of search is so interesting, because it forces you into questioning the data and understanding kind of movements and analysis deeper than just taking it and reporting it back. I'd never recommend that. I'd always validate, I'd always understand or try to understand data. I've looked at kind of the tea market as well. What's really interesting in the tea market is in kind of 2017, if you look at the dynamics, there was a huge shift over to private label. Um, that wasn't replicated in kind of share of search immediately. Now, because private label is almost impossible to see via share of search for obvious reasons. Now, there was data out there on commodity prices with tea, and what we saw was that the price of tea went up in 2017, um, which explained away the huge shift out of kind of brand into private label in 2017. Um, that was all kind of desk-based research, but understanding the dynamics, and the hypothesis was and stands that when price of tea goes up, people move to private label because they think it's the cheapest. Now, actually, within the tea market, that's not always the case, and there are some brands, large brands, which have and well-known brands which are actually cheaper average price than private label, but the framing of it and the expectation is, and we saw that consistently when we analyzed it. But I suppose the point is that share of search analysis took me to questioning that, because there was a difference between market share and there was a difference between share of search, and I was looking to explain it. And that's ultimately um, why I think it's such a powerful tool, because it forces, or metric, it forces you into asking questions and understanding the context, if you use it properly rather than just reporting on it. As I've said previously, I'm not a quant, I'm not a mathematician. I know how to use data and manipulate it, but I'm not a kind of super whiz in that area. I'm a strategist. So in applying it, I kind of always recommend validation, but then once you've validated it and you've delved in and you've explained some differences between share of search and share of market, and various other dynamics that may be explainable, then it's a question of applying it in interesting ways. Now, one of the pushbacks on a lot of Les Binet and Peter Field's work is how applicable is it in the real world. And what share of search actually allows you to do is, because you have this comparative measure, you can apply some of the techniques. Finally, it's not just about spending thousands of pounds to access the IPA databank, or I suppose spending thousands of pounds to access one of the big research companies' market share data. You can do it yourself. So share of voice versus share of market, or share of voice versus share of search, becomes a tool or a technique that you can apply. It's also worth remembering that you have this data going back, longitudinal data going back 2004. So instead of singular points um, on a crosstab, you can actually begin to chart this data over time. So you begin to be able to see movements over time, and you can hypothesize around what caused those movements, and explain those shifts. So share of voice versus share of search is one. The Jones model, extra share of voice versus share of search is another. I also kind of recommend the dynamic Jones model, essentially over time. You get two lovely charts over time and whether they follow each other, and you can explain kind of shifts, inputs versus outputs. Um, the other technique that I like to use is to turn share of search into change. So annual change in share of search, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, negative. So you have kind of essentially growth rates. Now, what you can then do is look at growth in share of search, change in share of search, versus share of voice. And you have a quadrant then, because they're positive and negative. And I find quadrant analysis, this is one of the most kind of impactful pieces of analysis that I developed, and that I recommend using, because when you plot your brands like this, you can hypothesize around what's driving growth. Now, in some categories, what you'll get is a linear line. You'll have X share of voice and growth is negative, to X share of voice and growth is positive. So you go along that kind of upwards from left to right. But in other categories, brands may sit in all four quadrants. Some may be overspending and declining. Some may be underspending and growing, efficient growth versus inefficient growth, geared for growth, or kind of managing decline. And yes, you're using advertising and marketing spend as an input here, but if a business isn't using visible tracked media spend to drive growth, then what is it using? Is it using kind of performance media? Um, you might not have the data, but you can certainly do some research around whether kind of they're spending in Facebook. Are they just using PPC? There will be enough for you to intuit whether they're doing that or not. Or do they rely on other methods of growing? Have they got highly efficient sales teams that go out and sell their product for them? That's what the quadrant analysis allows you to do. You begin to plot out various different business growth strategies. Remember, you validated share of search versus share of market as well. So you'll have read through the company reports probably, and you'll get a sense of kind of what's effective and what they're doing to drive growth, and whether they mention marketing investment or whether they don't. So it begins to become kind of part of a whole contextual piece of analysis, getting you to ask kind of questions around the business and the category itself. There's also kind of proportions of spend in kind of advertising as well. Um, you get hold of your ad dynamics data, spend data, and you proportion it over time. You do moving annual totals, and you put that split of spend versus your share of search on a brand by brand basis, and you can fairly quickly work out, even using that data, whether a business or brand is being ineffective or inefficient with its investment choices. There's a great case study in motor with a brand that has been around for a long, long time, and is still reasonably big, but is declining. Um, and whilst the quality of the cars has a massive impact, I would argue that the mix that's being used to promote those cars is inefficient and ineffective. So it's not acting as a brake on decline, the advertising. It's actually probably hurrying the decline along. And it's stuff like that that you can begin to tease out of this analysis. Um, One of the other techniques that I use, based on the hypothesis, or fairly simple logic build, which is okay, so if share of search is kind of an accurate proxy, then when you're calculating it, what is the total representative of? So you've averaged all those indices, you've added them up at the end, and that's the total. You're dividing your average 12-month buy to get your share of search. Well, that total at the end of those indices, well, that represents the size of the market and whether that market is growing or declining as well, because the rate of growth. Um, Now that's really interesting as well. And if you plot that on a cumulative basis from year dot on a monthly basis, then what you actually see is the rate of growth of the category as an S curve, or innovation curve. And I've seen categories, and admittedly, it's categories that are fairly new because, or have been through a significantly new growth phase in the last near 20 years. Um, you can see that S curve in action, or you can see multiple S curves, periods of rapid growth. New entrants maybe come in, legislation happens, the market kind of shifts. And you can begin to go, well, hang on a bit, right? There's two S curves here. What does that actually mean? You've then got the Rogers kind of innovation curve, and you could estimate using that. Okay, well, the Rogers innovation curve tells us that at this stage in the S curve, you expect to be 50% penetrate, 60% penetration of the market. Well, is that true? Can we validate that elsewhere? You can see how this begins to get you a rich understanding of the dynamics of the market that previously weren't accessible um, to planners, to strategists, to business people, essentially. How often have you seen an S curve charted? Very, very rarely based on actual data. I certainly hadn't in my career prior to identifying this on a regular basis outside of textbooks, etc. So now you've got it. Might not always be applicable for your category. There might not be an S curve visibly present because you know what, there just isn't, or the market may be flat and you've hit the top. Obviously, there's an opportunity there itself as to what the next strategic step should be. We see that in some digital categories where penetration is almost reached, 100%. Well, how do they continue to grow? What should those businesses be doing to grow? Is it about driving switches or is it basket value? Because if they're not able to kind of uh, drive that penetration higher, then it's about an internal market or a shift or I hate to use the word pivot, maybe not, but an expansion. Um, Gives you that macro view, helps you explain certain things, even if there's no movement in that S curve if it's broadly flat. Um, so yes, that's another technique that is in there. The challenge is actually out there for people to use this and to find out more. So in a previous life or previous job, I was talking about whether the biggest stick to beat the IPA databank and Les and Peter's work around survivorship bias can actually be overcome because you've now got access to a comparative metric um, for the winners and the losers. So can you hypothesize what actually led the losers to lose? Is it luck? Were they just unlucky? But it allows you to build those new cases. Is there a kind of new entrant category, and you can hypothesize around average rates of growth. We certainly saw it in one of the new categories that I saw is that the growth trajectory of all the brands, once you kind of um, zeroed it in from launch to the same week, um, was almost identical. So those brands grew despite this probably challenging a lot of kind of people's initial thinking, but those brands grew at the same rate despite what they were doing. It was consistent in that category anyway. No one was outperforming the rate of growth. Doesn't happen in all categories, but it certainly did in that. And that's why I think this metric is powerful because, again, I'm reiterating, I know there's been a lot of challenges. I know there's been a lot of challenges around the data. It's a random data source. There's a lot of variability at very low levels. A brand can change from 1 to 2, which is 100% change in kind of the space of 2 days. There are ways around it. Bad PR can shift the brand. House of Fraser, perfect example. Share of search went through the roof when it was essentially dying on its or on its last legs before it was bought by the Frasers, or what became the Frasers Group. Um, I know all that. I know all that. I know the limits of this data. But if you do too, and you're able to explain those limits and mitigate for them, and you do your due diligence in your research and you try and understand and hypothesize this data source and what you're seeing and explaining, then at a macro level, this is phenomenally useful and impactful. It has true value at C-suite level, has true value kind of for businesses. I mean, even a brand like I think it's Just Eat uses it in its company reports um, as a representation of market share, essentially, and how they're performing against the other delivery businesses. Um, like that's how fundamental this data source could be, and why those techniques are so powerful, and where they take you to, and force you into thinking about. And ultimately, that's what data should be. It's a question mark. It's not the answer. Um, so can you answer that question that share of search posits? Can you answer that question that the data analysis posits? Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of this talk. But I'd like to kind of thank kind of the guys over at Isolated Talks. Giles, thank you for inviting me to do this. But also a kind of request around donating to Samaritans. Please do it. There are dozens of amazing talks on the website. You'll find many that you're really interested in, and hopefully mine has been reasonably interesting as well. If you are interested in hearing more, then obviously I'm out there, and yeah, I'm sure I'll hear from you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.